Today's episode is from The Game Plan, in which Coach Terry Shea joined me during the season to discuss different aspects of the game that affect teams in season. In this one, we also transitioned into some things to think about for the offseason. So if you're making a playoff run, there's some great things for you here. We start talking about team travel, playing on different surfaces. We think about overtime, going for two, and then we get into an analysis of the run game. So a lot to check out here for you, whether you're still playing this season or not. Enjoy this one on playoff tips and run game analysis.
We are here for our special segment called The Game Plan with our co-host, Coach Terry Shea. Coach Shea, great to be talking with you again.
Thank you very much, Keith. I'm looking forward to our discussion today. This is the exciting time of the year for so many of the high school coaches around the country.
Absolutely. We have a lot of those teams maybe beginning their playoff run or moving on to the second round of the playoffs. And as we get into the playoffs, as we get out of those early rounds, which usually are played either as a home game or a little bit closer to home, teams start having to take longer trips maybe than they're used to. They might have to play at a neutral site. They might have to play in a bigger venue than they're used to. A lot of times some of these neutral sites will be big college football stadiums, which present a little bit of a different environment than what those high school players are used to. And then we'll get into, for those teams going into the playoffs or continuing, we'll get into some overtime ideas, as well as talking about go-for-two decisions. In the second half of the show, we're gonna talk to those coaches who finished their season, and we'll talk about run game analysis. Kind of a long list of things to do. We'll run through it today, Coach, but let's start with moving on in the playoffs and taking some of those longer trips. When you have those situations, Coach, and I know, at the college level, Division III level, we kind of had a rule of thumb that anything over 2 hours, we were going to stay overnight. The reality of it in high school is that maybe you have to take that longer trip and play that same day. So sometimes they extend that far. Sometimes, we're still talking maybe an hour, which might be longer than a team is used to. But what advice do you have for those coaches and those teams who are starting to take longer trips as they progress through the playoffs?
Well, I'm going to reflect back to my first coaching opportunity, and that was at the junior college level up in the Great Northwest. And we would always take road trips for our games by bus, which I'm sure that's what the high school teams are all about. Mm-hmm. And I still remember how important this was, and that was if you were taking a road trip that required you to be on the bus, more than say 2 hours, we would always have a plan to stop somewhere and allow the players to get off the bus and kind of flex their legs for about 15 to 20 minutes. And we also maybe had at that stopping point, we may have had a box of fruit, bananas, oranges, whatever the coaches may think of, and we presented that to the players. So they got back on the bus, and now they resumed. Maybe you have a trip that's 3 hours long. We would always try to make the second segment of the trip a little bit shorter than the first segment. So you could divide that up in a 3-hour trip. You'd have a 2 hours drive, and then you'd stop over, get out and exercise for 15, 20 minutes, and then resume your trip and finish up on an hour's drive. So that's one idea. And the second one, Keith, I want to make sure the coaches really appreciate this, is whatever your plans are, schedule-wise, itinerary-wise, you want to make sure you always, write it up to being early, because that takes into account if you have a distraction or something happens during the course of the trip, you've built into your itinerary about a half an hour to an hour time where you don't feel like you're getting to your destination point late or rushing your athlete. Keith, if you don't mind, I'll tell the coaches one real quick story that
Sure.
Going back to my history. Bill Walsh, when he was coaching at the 49ers, Bill told me this story, and that was they were getting ready to play in their very first Super Bowl opportunity against the Bengals. And I think the game was in Detroit, Michigan. And so they had an early bus, left the hotel, players got on that, got to the stadium. Then they had the later bus, and Bill Walsh and his some of his players were on the later bus, and they got to about 20 minutes from the stadium. They got into this iron tight road jam, traffic jam, and they realized that if they sat there in traffic, believe it or not, Super Bowl Sunday, all that business, that they may not even get there in time to, probably get there just when pregame warm-up was scheduled. So they all jumped out of the bus and they ended up kind of jogging to the stadium. And here's the champion 49ers jogging to a Super Bowl. So you have to kind of plan your itineraries accordingly and be prepared for the unexpected. And that's what I would encourage the coaches to always consider when they put their team on the road.
Yeah, Coach, that's something, I reflect back on my high school career, and there were times when we took trips. I recall one when I was, just an assistant on the staff, and we were taking a longer trip, and our coach got us out probably about 45 minutes to an hour away, just like you said, breaking that trip up. And what we did during that about 20 minutes or so is we did just a real quick walkthrough of things. So the players were up and moving, but we also got them focused a little bit mentally too, and a little bit sharp on there. And obviously, it's a little different today. And I'm thinking back to that time when cell phones weren't even in existence, that now these players actually can do a lot of review, even of film, right on the bus. So I think it's an opportunity for coaches to think about what kind of things you might put together for your players. If you don't want them on the phone, I always like the idea of putting together a quick tip sheet. It's something we did at the college level. Is every coach, someone would do it through as we got into using Huddle. Some of it would do it through Huddle and put together a short presentation for their players. Others would still put it on paper or do both, where it include all the game plan tips for those players to review. We did it both home and away, but obviously before they got on the bus, we'd give that to them, and they'd have the opportunity to review that along the way. And, for them, we told them their mental preparation was up to them. I don't believe it's something you can force. I think you want to encourage it, but at the same time, players do have a routine, and they just have to adjust it for the travel.
Oh, that's a really good idea. And your thought about the cell phone idea is, boy, that's modernized travel tremendously for football teams. So, yes, you're right. The one thing I'd encourage the coaches to consider, and that is the coaches tend to think about the travel to the game, and then they kind of forget about what it takes to get back to their home base, and you've got another 3-hour trip to get back to the home base, and they might consider putting a little touch of class to the travel, and that is maybe the booster club or the parents can provide a box lunch, for the players, or those individual pizzas when they get back on the bus to travel home. I think that could resonate very positively to the players, and they tend to think, hey, if we have to travel again, this isn't too bad. But just remember, there's a 3-hour trip back home as well.
Absolutely, and that's something, when you look at how you organize that, someone needs to be put in charge of it. I would certainly consider having the boosters do that, or a parent, but at the same time have a coach who is kind of a liaison with that. Certainly a good place. We talked about putting those younger coaches to work, or guys from the younger parts of our program, the freshman team being done, that would be a good thing maybe to put on their shoulders and say, hey, we need you to make sure as the game's winding down, that order's placed, or that's ready to go at that location. We get it delivered to the stadium, get it delivered to the buses. We used to do that, and at the college all the time, that when the players would shower up and put their bags back under the bus, that as they're getting on, they were getting that box lunch, or like you said, a pizza or something like that. So certainly you want to take into consideration the post game as well, and those guys definitely are going to be hungry after the game and having to take that long trip home.
Amen. Players are always hungry.
Exactly. Well, Coach, the other thing that comes up as we make our journey through the playoffs here is starting to play in maybe some different types of venues than we're used to. Certainly playing on the road always presents a challenge, but now when, you think of playing in some of those bigger college stadiums, which starts to happen in a lot of states for playoff teams, that begins to be a little bit different feeling for the players as well. It reminds me of of the great movie. It's a basketball movie, but the movie Hoosiers, at the end where that little small town is playing in the state championship game, and they're playing in this big arena, and the coach takes them all out on the floor and does a couple measurements to show them that, hey, the field dimensions are still the same, nothing's changed there, which obviously is important. But I think you have those guys maybe who get in awe a little bit of the environment, and how would you approach that and kind of settle the players down into being able to play in that kind of a stadium, that kind of a venue?
The concept that I've always believed in is to get your players to the location, wherever that may be, in terms of the stadium location, and get them, if you have a typical during the season schedule of making sure the players are inside the locker room 2 hours before kickoff, let's say, we always added another half hour whenever we went on the road and we were seeing the stadium for the very first time. And so we would get to the site of the game maybe 2.5 hours early before kickoff, so that the players had a chance to walk around the stadium and walk around the field, and when there's hardly anyone inside the venue, and let them get a feel for the layout and that sort of thing. And so we always wanted to arrive, like I mentioned, a half hour to 45 minutes earlier than the prescribed time. And I will say this, Keith, I always used to, even when I had the NFL quarterbacks at any level, I always encouraged the quarterbacks to go out onto the field and walk the field. And most fields now are turf fields, but I would still have them walk the field, look around, find the scoreboard, in the college game, find the play clock as well as the game clock, and just get a feel as to the end zones. Is there, if you're playing on a grass field, are the 5-yard lines torn up more so than the middle of the field? Just have a feeling for where the hot spots are on a particular game field. If that's true of the quarterback position, I would encourage, on a playoff kind of setting, to put the whole team out on the field and let them walk around and just get a feel of everything. And that 45-minute time can be used very well.
Absolutely, and you mentioned the fields being turf now. It's becoming a little bit of a lost art as a play caller. I would go and do that exact thing and walk around the field and take into consideration that, hey, when we're on this hash in this area of the field, it might not be good to run outside because it's a little slick here, or the field's torn up, or those kinds of things actually used to play a big part in how you might call plays in different areas of the field. So something coaches don't have to worry about as much today.
Exactly. And that can spill over into an overtime situation where, you either win the toss or you elect to take the game to one side of the field to the other, one end of the field to the other, and you might have a distinct reason why you want to play. If you're on the road, you might want to play that overtime period at the end of the field, away from the crowd. That's a possibility. It certainly benefits teams to get a feel for the venue they're playing in, and you've got to assess that very early in the evening. You don't have too many other opportunities to understand how important that is, and you want to make the right decisions at the right time.
Absolutely, Coach, and I think that's a great transition into our next topic, which is overtime. And obviously, first, knowing which side of the field you want to play on if you have that decision. But obviously, earlier in the week, we've talked about practicing this situation before. But obviously, as you start to see high quality opponents, there becomes that chance that things might be tied up at the end of the game, and both planning for and practicing that in advance now becomes critical. I think the other thing we need to think about, we've talked about planning and practicing that, we can revisit that, but also that plan, obviously, that you set in place and say, here's our things we want to do if we hit an overtime period, which basically, you look at a lot of red zone offense because you're going to start at the 20 in most states. What do you need to do? What do you need to look at to adjust those things as you move down the field. Let's talk about that first, and the idea of what do you want to put together, what do you want to put into a game plan for those overtime periods?
Keith, you're playing essentially in the red zone in an overtime situation, but what I would do, and as a college coach, we had overtime when I was coaching in college, and as a play caller, I would always script a series for overtime, and then there were some games where I would script 2 series in case you went into a second overtime playoff. So that kind of settled me down. I knew exactly what the first script was. You may have 4 or 5 plays you have scripted, and then of course you have to call the other parts of the game in overtime according to down and distance. But that was important. I always assessed, do I have a field goal kicker that I really believe can drop a dime in there, from the 20-yard line on a kick? If not, I better make, plans to know what I'm doing on 4th down. Which way do I want to play which end of the stadium do I want to play in? Do they have a very strong field goal kicker? Consequently, maybe I don't have a great field goal kicker. I want to go to the side of the field where the wind's blowing against the kicker. So there's that element as well. But I always found that scripting was so good because it settled you down. You knew exactly what you wanted to call rather than to all of a sudden say, oh, my goodness, now I've got to come up with play calls for an overtime period. And the last thought I want to leave with the coaches, Keith, is, and I still remember my one overtime game at Rutgers. We were playing Pittsburgh, and I wanted to take a shot. I think in the college game, it's a 25-yard line, regulation as compared to high school, where I think it's, as you mentioned, 20. But I always wanted to take a shot for the end zone on the very first down of the series. And sure enough, I threw a corner route, had the quarterback sprint halfway, roll, throw back to a backside corner, and you're making a throw that if your guy doesn't catch it, the ball kind of sails out of bounds, and now you play for 2nd and 10. But if you hit it, boy, you can really disrupt your opponent. And sure enough, we hit it. Pittsburgh couldn't, adapt to that, and we ended up winning the overtime in one period. So it's not a bad idea to have a shot play in your script where your quarterback's going to feel like, man, I'm going to take a shot for the end zone.
Absolutely, and that's again where your red zone game plan comes into place, and what you might want to think about, because over the course of the game, you might use up some of those plays that you've had planned. That maybe there's the same play dressed up a little bit. Maybe it's motioning to the formation you want to end up in, and putting some of those plays in there. But obviously, I think you have to have those plays which take a shot, because it becomes tougher and tougher to get the ball in the end zone as you get closer, especially if you have to use the passing game.
Yes, and here's a compass for play calling, and that is, in an overtime period, like in the red zone, you want to think players rather than plays.
Absolutely.
And you want to evaluate, okay, who are my playmakers? Who was, who's gifted enough to get the ball in the end zone for us when we really need it? And you want to tend to call those plays rather than just a group of plays that you feel comfortable about. You want to make sure you think your talent, your players, over the plays that you call. So, boy, that is a real challenge for coaches, because they tend to forget about that, and they tend to forget that their best player is their halfback or their tailback, and they don't give them the ball, on the first series. Somehow the ball goes to somebody else, and I think you're really overlooking an opportunity to win a playoff game or win an overtime game by getting the ball in the hands of your best players.
Absolutely. It's always about players. I think I told you in the beginning, one of my freshman coaches always used to say, give me players, not plays. And obviously we want to get the ball into the hands of our best player when it comes down to crunch time, when it comes down to a decision to win the game. And speaking of those decisions, Coach, we've talked about practicing 2-point plays throughout the season and making sure that that's something you're working on. We never really got into the decision part of that and the rule of thumb for decisions. And that might happen at the end of the game. It might happen maybe when a team is able to take a lead, maybe middle of the fourth quarter or something like that. And it certainly can happen in overtime. But as far as making that decision, what do you look at maybe as a rule of thumb for when you go for two versus when you kick it?
Well, when you want to win the game, you go for two. There's a great team out in California, De La Salle High School, and they had this phenomenal winning streak. I think De La Salle won something like, I can't even remember, but it's a national record. But I was there as a college coach recruiting, watching them play a championship game out in California before the winning streak started. The coach decided the De La Salle coach decided to go for two at the end of an overtime period when he could have very easily kicked it and sent it into a second overtime. And sure enough, he said his players wanted to end the game right there. Well, they ended up not winning that game. And if they had won that game, they had won about 30-some games in a row to that point. You tack on 31 more games to that phenomenal winning streak that they reeled off. God, they would have had 120-some games in a row. So there's a team that decided to go for two just because the coach felt like the emotion of the game and the players were calling for it. You have to listen to your players, and then you have to make a decision that's void of emotion as a coach. And so that's the fine line a coach sometimes walks. But I think it comes down to, let's go back, I think, in preparation for the 2-point conversion. And that is, and then, again, I go back to my history with Bill Walsh, and he taught me one very valuable lesson, and that was to always practice two different 2-point plays, because you may need a second one, but at least your players understand here's the call we're going to have, and they can look forward to it. They have that confidence. They have that that comfort that, hey, we practice this, and let's win it here with this particular play. So it's very important that coaches put their players through a practice mode when it comes to 2-point conversions. And then the second phase of it is what happens if there's a penalty and your illegal procedure. Now you're on the 7-yard line or the 8-yard line, and you have to come up with a play from there. So, always have that in your mind too, in terms of, God, what if we face adversity all of a sudden and now we're not on the 2 or 3 yard line, we're on the 8-yard line. Or maybe it's a penalty on the defense, and maybe you're on the 1-yard line or 1.5-yard line. So you want to have that play call ready to go as well. In terms of decision making, I always had a point chart, and I know they're out there, where it says, okay, it's time to go for two. It's not time to go for two. I think that the general thinking, influenced by television more and more in the NFL game, is that you don't go for two early in the game. Well, I'm not so sure at the high school level I would buy into that. I think if the point spread in the third quarter were something where I wanted to get it back to a one-possession game, or I wanted to stay ahead of the opponent with a making it a 2-possession game, I think I'd go for 2 points. I wouldn't subscribe to that NFL theory that you don't want to go too early. The NFL game is a totally different game, and they have totally different kickers, skill-wise, and so I would lean toward the point spread. If you're down by 5 and it's the third quarter, I think I'd go for 2 to make it a 3-point game. So that's what I would choose to do, Keith.
Coach, what about that decision in overtime? You're battling it out with an opponent. Maybe they've gone in and scored on their possession and kicked the extra point. You go in and score, and 2 points wins the game. 1 obviously ties it and sends it to another extra overtime period. Do you have any thoughts on making that decision, and when is it time to pull the trigger and go for 2?
Well, I've always subscribed to the idea that if I felt like the other team had more talent than your team, if I had a chance to win it in overtime, prematurely, I would go for two. And with the idea that if the longer the game goes, their talent level will start to, become the X factor. So that's one way to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
The other aspect is I would certainly assess what kind of a place kicker I had, what kind of a long snapper I had. I think that's so important. When you choose to tie it up or choose not to go for one and take the 2-point opportunity. So that's another X factor. And I think another factor would be, what is the health of my football team? Are we tired? Have we exhausted ourselves? Has our defense played way too many plays leading up to the overtime? Those things I would take into account as well, and that would prompt me to go for two.
Because those are great tips and things to consider in making that tough decision, and ultimately, you're going to be judged one way or the other. I think as a coach, you need to stand with it and realize there was a reason why you made it. And if you didn't, don't beat yourself up over it. If you've thought about all those things, you certainly have the right to make those calls. And sometimes you got to live with them. But I would tell coaches, you got to stand strong, especially with your team, and taking the accountability for that, but at the same time knowing it was the right thing to do.
Boy, that is so important for a coach to. You're right, Keith. For a coach to stand in front of his football team after a big decision like that, and say the right thing. Every coach should give some forethought to that. If that situation were to ever come up.
Coach, as we move on to talking about some things for teams who have finished their season, we're going to focus here on analyzing the run game for just a few minutes and pointing out some areas that we can start to look at as we start to break down our offense and look for areas where we might be able to improve or strengthen ourselves for the next season. So, I've broken it down. Something I did was I would look at 6 areas in analyzing the run game. And the first thing I wanted to look at, and believe me, Coach, this became much easier with the advent of some of the technologies like Huddle. I remember used to do this on a pad of paper and then have to crunch the numbers manually, but now it becomes so much easier. But going through and looking at each of our run calls and our different run concepts or different run plays and determining which ones were efficient for us and defining run efficiency as gaining 4 or more yards per run, or if it was a short yardage situation, picking up the first down. And that was something, depending on where we were at, we would look at, having a goal of being at 55% or better for that run, to consider that it was effective for us. And we would certainly do that throughout the season, but as the season ends, looking at every single run and starting with that, which ones were efficient and which ones weren't. And obviously then from there, there's a lot of things you can do to determine maybe what needs a little bit more work, maybe what needs to go.
Yes, and Keith, I'd encourage the coaches when the season does bring the final curtain down, the coach needs to step away and before he gets into his postseason or out of season research and evaluation, just give yourself a week or two before you get into these kind of projects. And that kind of clears your mind. It takes the sting of the season out of the emotion of it, and then get after your project of analyzing your run game and every other aspect of your season. But the other thing, Keith, that I'd encourage the coaches to always look at is the game is played situationally. The game is all about situations. So you want to evaluate what run call did I make that was very successful at the beginning of each drive during the course of the season. The drive starters, what run was really hitting that goal of 4 yards or better on the first call of each drive. I think that's that's a tone setter. That sets the tempo for your offense. Oftentimes, is what kind of success you have on that very initial play of a drive. And then I also go into the red zone and figure out, okay, what runs were really good for us in the red zone, and do I have the same personnel coming back next year that would allow me to think that these same runs will also be very positive. So, any situation you alluded to the third down and short situation, conversion wise, all of those different situations, I think, carries far more value than just assessing an overall run game, is to put them into different situations that obviously come up every game throughout the course of the season.
Absolutely, Coach. And on the flip side of that, for defensive coaches, I think looking at what the opponent has done with different runs, I think you can discover over the course of the season that maybe there were some runs that you didn't fit quite well, and that could be attributed, as you dig into it deeper, to it could be a personnel matter, it could be a scheme or concept matter, but obviously the numbers start to tell you something. And I had a defensive coordinator always emphasized to me that statistics were only a starting point for looking at something, but you have to understand that there's a lot more meaning as you dig deeper. And I think your point is that you have to look into those situations as well. The other thing I think about when we consider analyzing a run game is looking at explosive plays. The fact of the matter is that it's very hard to drive the ball down the field 3 or 4 yards at a time, that you're going to need your runs to explode for you at times as well. And kind of analyzing and looking for, how did we create some of those explosive runs? A typical power run, for example, might become better again because of the situation. It might have been the personnel group. Maybe we added an extra hat into the blocking scheme somehow to get onto a safety that was typically coming down and springs the run. So again, looking at where do those explosive plays come from and the opportunities that you create with those, and on the reverse side of it, looking for some of the things that maybe cause those lost yardage or hits behind the line of scrimmage. Maybe some of your plays have some scheme or air problem or assignment problems that cause those things to happen. And obviously, a defensive coordinator would want to look at those things too. What defense, from our defenses, what defenses maybe gave up some explosive runs? And I think those, again, looking at two more factors there. In addition to the run efficiency, the explosive plays and the lost yardage plays give you an idea of what's going on with your run game or your run defense.
Very well put. The explosive play idea is so important to assess as an offense, and you have to be careful. You walk a fine line sometimes because maybe your ball carrier was a senior and he happened to have outstanding speed, and sometimes his speed will simply show up by outrunning the defenders in a high school competition, and that lends itself to an explosive play. You have to understand that maybe you won't have that same style of runner the next year, and you've got to make sure that you don't get fooled into thinking that, well, we had these kind of explosive plays and they'll show up again next year. You want to make sure that the X factor is, do I have the same kind of ball carrier, running the play that, lend itself to 25 yards at a chunk. So that's important too to assess, is what kind of style of running game will I have next year based on the talent that I have coming back with my team. So that's what we call forward thinking. And as a coach and as an offensive scheme, you want to make sure you're very forward thinking in your anticipation for the next season. So the other thing is I remember my experience at the Kansas City Chiefs when we had one of the all-time best red zone kind of run game that's the NFL's ever seen, but we had a heck of an offensive line. and we also had a heck of a running back by the name of Priest Holmes. And so we were very successful with everything we attempted run-wise inside the red zone. You have to understand that someday you're not going to have Priest Holmes, and you have to anticipate, okay, where do we go from here? So coaches, keep that in mind when you think to the next season in terms of your own personnel.
And Coach, that for looking at an analysis, those are the three things I'd always start with. The run efficiency, explosive plays, and the lost yardage plays. And then it was the opportunity really to get into three other areas before I would even get into some of those situational things. And those three other areas we look at would be formation and personnel group, which obviously start to tell you a little bit about the efficiency and maybe future game plans of the people you have in the game. The fronts that we're running against, and the idea there is I think as you evolve your offense and as your staff begins to start understanding it a little bit better as you run it with your players, is that you start to find some answers that maybe are good against certain fronts. In the last part, looking at stunts and blitzes as well, because I know there's a lot of pressure teams out there who like to do things, and I think you can find opportunities that maybe certain runs are good against a certain type of stunt or blitz that a team might employ. So obviously, you start with some of the basics, and then you start looking at other things like that. And I'll include a link. I have an article on this. I'll include it in the show notes, but. As you mentioned before, starting with the big chunks of information and then really starting to understand what those numbers mean and how they break down into different areas is a key for analyzing your run game.
Sure, very well put. I think the component that seems to be showing up more and more in high school and college football is the ability for your quarterback to run. And boy, is that an X factor that coaches have to always consider when they start thinking about putting together a run game or a run scheme for the season, is to assess, okay, do I go to the Wildcat or do I even need to? Because I've got a quarterback who can carry the ball 8 times a game and average 5 yards a carry. So, boy, that's back in the early days of college football, say the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, you didn't have a quarterback, directed run game. And so that's exciting to have the ability to say, okay, I've got a young quarterback coming up in the ranks. And, as long as I can keep him healthy, we've got a great runner there at that position and take advantage of that.
Absolutely, and I think when you start breaking down some of those runs, your quarterback runs, you do find those opportunities for some explosive plays because you get that extra hat in the run game.
Yes, and another thing, Keith, that I would look at, I remember very succinctly looking at this, and that is so many times if you throw the ball on first down, you end up 2nd and 10, and you want to have a very efficient run call that gets you back to 3rd and manageable, it being able to manage the situation, get you back to 3rd and 3 maybe, or 3rd and 2 or 3rd and 4. So you want to have a run that you can call on 2nd and 10, and it's not necessarily a draw play because, as you know, defensive coaches alert their side of the ball that look for draws when it's 2nd and 10, and so you want to have a run call that will get you back into a workable situation on 3rd down, if not get you 10 yards, and now you move the sticks. But, boy, that's important to have several key runs in that kind of a situation as well.
Yeah, you definitely want to uncover those things in this type of analysis. And I think to wrap things up on my end, from my perspective, Coach, I highly encourage this practice of going through and breaking down and analyzing your plays, looking for answers, and also looking for maybe some holes in what you were doing, holes in your offense, places where you need answers, because I think that's going to direct you as you head into your off season. Because with clinics today and all the stuff you can find online, I think you can get enamored with all kinds of different ideas that work for other people, but you have to remember you're looking at how things fit within your system and how can you make your system better. And it might be that you find some things that you can add that fit well, but it also might be that the answers are right there with everything you're doing, and you just have to maybe be a little bit more organized or a little bit more detailed in your teaching, and that's what an analysis like this can tell you.
Well, that's the way you create a chance to have a winning program year after year. And well said, Keith. I think the one culprit in this off season for coaches is to get, as you mentioned, too many new ideas that takes you away from your base or your personality, and all of a sudden now you've got on the right hand column of your list you've got 20 new ideas to add to your base or to your foundation, and you have to be very careful not to overdo that and to make sure that the new ideas fit who you are as a coach and what you want your football team to be when it comes to the running game.
Absolutely. Well, Coach, it was great talking about all those ideas for the teams who are out there and continuing on with the season. Best of luck as you head into the playoffs here and progress through a playoff run.
Oh, that's great. And I wish all the coaches the best, too. And make sure your field goal kicker is primed for a winning kick so you don't have to go for two.
Absolutely, Coach. I look forward to talking to you more next week.
Okay, thanks, Keith.